All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to AMS Weatherband's latest webinar. This is the Psychology of Disaster with Jolie Wills and moderated by Dr. Susan Jasko. Before we begin, I would like to address some of the ground rules for our webinar today. First, if you have any questions during the webinar, would you be so kind as to put it in the Q&A option that we have on the bottom of your Zoom screen? If you look down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see where normally the chat button is there. It will be there still. We're not going to use chat because any questions and anything that you would like to ask our guests today should go in the Q&A option. It helps us keep track of the actual questions and the things that the audience is wondering about. So please put all your questions in the Q&A. Also, kindly keep your cameras off. I know it's not really an issue, but just in case, wanted to make sure that that is said. We will have some specific time for questions from the audience after the interview. So as the presentation progresses, don't hesitate to add your question to the Q&A, but we will get to it at the tail end of everything. All right. So, folks, first I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator. Thank you, Dr. Jasko, for joining us today. Dr. Jasko is currently a senior research social scientist at the Center for Advanced Public Safety at Alabama University. She leads social science efforts in research about the intersection of weather and society, warning communication, and interorganizational and cross-expert communication. Wow. Prior to assuming her position at CAPS, she taught at the university level for 25 years. She currently leads the human-focused and social science aspects of several grants for CAPS. In addition, she works with NOAA and NWS and the broader weather enterprise in addressing both organizational and external communication challenges through serving on assessment teams, informal and informal meetings, and by serving in a range of capacities in the American Meteorological Society and the National Weather Association, and by making presentations at a range of weather-related conferences. So, Dr. Jasko, without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks, Gideon. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome again, everybody. We're so excited that you're here, and we're also very excited about this presentation and this presenter. We're really fortunate to have Jolie Wills with us today. Jolie is a leading psychosocial expert in disaster and disruption. Jolie has studied how the mind works under prolonged pressure, how we make decisions, and how our reactions and behaviors are impacted by stress. Jolie is herself a survivor of the Christchurch earthquake and has lived disaster recovery with her family firsthand. She led the psychosocial recovery program for New Zealand Red Cross in response to the earthquakes and has supported those working in disasters around the world. Jolie is a Winston Churchill Fellow recipient, a Leadership New Zealand alumna, an Edmund Hillary Fellow, a co-author of Leading in Disaster Recovery, A Companion Through the Chaos, and is an advising member to the Global Counter Terrorism Prevention Network. Everybody, welcome Jolie, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And there might have been some hints in that introduction, but you can maybe tell that I'm from New Zealand. I don't know if that is at all obvious, but I just want to apologize first up if my accent is a little bit tricky along the way. So please throw anything in the Q&A if there's anything I've said that does not translate or that just you didn't understand. That wouldn't be a first. So I'm not precious at all. So please just let me know if there's anything that you want me to cover again or in a different way. But I want to start with today's workshop or today's session, really thinking about a key message, and it's a sobering one, right? And it's that risk and uncertainty and change at an incredibly fast pace, right? That's really they're defining features of our times right now. That risk, uncertainty, climate change generally, there's a whole lot going on in our world at the moment. And so hummingly, we're all about applying the lessons from disasters to support the well-being resilience of leaders, organizations, and communities. So for us, it's about creating a future-ready world by packaging up some of the lessons from disasters into, pretty incredible learning experiences. So that's what we aim to do. But I want to give you a little bit of context, a little bit of background. And Elizabeth, my co-founder, and I, we like to say that our careers have quite literally been a series of disasters. And I mean that in the literal sense, and that Elizabeth started with what we know in New Zealand as the Boxing Day tsunami. That might be the Great East Indian Ocean tsunami. And we've worked in disasters around the world, and the two of us met working on the Christchurch earthquakes. And as Susan mentioned, this was my home city at the time. And so, I was both working it and living it firsthand with my family. So when it comes to the psychology of disaster, I guess you could say that I've been my own social experiment. Yeah. And so today's session, I'm going to split into the psychology of disaster, into the before, the during and the immediate days, and the after, the long recovery. And my expertise is much more in the once the disaster has hit, but I do want to cover a little bit about the before. So if we start with the before, when it comes to preparation or warning, we are quite special creatures as human beings. So, I think what we tend to think is that we'll be given a weather warning or advice from emergency managers or from government officials or from first responders, right? And we'll act in accordance with that advice. That's a pretty sound assumption that, we often make. But we forever encounter perplexed and frustrated scientists and advisors. Why don't people take on what seems like really obvious sound advice? And so we often have this belief when we're communicating advice or information that, if we provide people with the information, and then because we are very rational human beings, the decisions and actions that we will take will follow in line with that information or that data or that advice. And sometimes, if we were really to look at that assumption, we realize that actually we're never ever that easy and straightforward as human beings, but sometimes we operate with that belief in a subconscious way. So actually there is a whole lot at play. We think, if I know something, then how can I not believe what follows from that knowledge? And then how can I not act in accordance with those factors? And actually there is a whole lot more at play, that we tend to see. What I'd like to do is start with a bit of a story. And this is not my own. This is from Amanda Ripley, The Unthinkable: Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. It's a book that I highly recommend, but it's a very good example of some of the things I want to take you through. And I'm going to call him Jack Barnes. So this guy is not his real name, and this is not his real photograph. Yeah. But Jack survived Hurricane Betsy way back in 1965. Right? It was a Category 5 storm with winds of up to 125 miles per hour. And he rode it out in his house with his kids and his elderly father. Some things to also know about Jack, he was a World War II veteran. He had a really good job with the Federal Housing Association. He really loved his family. He was the guy that cooked a roast every Sunday that the family gathered for. He decorated the house for them. He kind of was one of those guys that went all out. St. Patrick's Day, Valentine's Day, Christmas, he really went the whole hog. He always played Santa in his Santa suit. But his family also described him as being quite stubborn. He was the patriarch who often needed to be right. I guess the family lovingly described him as obstinate. Yeah. And sometimes his certainty, though, masked his fear. So he really hated hospitals. He still had nightmares, from his time in the war, some of the lingering effects of that. He was really afraid of dying. And so that's a little bit about Jack. And this is a New Orleans Hurricane Katrina story. So 3 days before Hurricane Katrina made landfall, the family knew the hurricane was going to be bad. And so they started making plans, and at this point, it's too early, is what Jack said, right? So this is 3 days out. 2 days beforehand, there was an evacuation notice that came out. And Jack said, storms always turn, right? They always have, they always turn. The day before, the advice on the television was, I want to emphasize that the first choice of every citizen should be to leave the city, right? Jack had that choice. But instead he went to mass like he did every Sunday. And he was, known to have told those around him, my family is aggravating me, but I'm staying. And so the family at this point, they thought, well, we can't evacuate and leave him behind. And so they decided they were going to ride out the storm in a house nearby that was much safer than where Jack was living. But Jack wouldn't do it, like they thought this way he wouldn't have to deal with evacuating the city, but he refused to join them. And he even got so annoyed with his kids that he eventually took the phone off the hook so that they couldn't ring him and bother him about it. But on the day that Katrina made landfall, Jack put the phone back on the hook and he had the last conversation with his family. And he did something that he very rarely did. And that's, he admitted that he'd made a mistake. And when the levees broke, they lost phone contact with him. And after the storm, Jack's body was found up in the attic near his Santa suit. So it's a really sad story, and I think about it, Jack had the information, Jack had the means, he had a car and he had a family full of people with cars heading out of town. But so what got in the way of that information, between the information and the action of evacuating? What got in the way between the two? I mean, the first one that's obvious to me is his firsthand experience of Hurricane Betsy was much more powerful to him, potentially, I'm guessing, than the data and than the word of the authorities or the entreaties of others around him. But I just want to take you through some of the cognitive science that sits behind this. And that's that, we have, when it comes to decision making, there is a lot at play that is really helpful to understand when it comes to the psychology of disasters. We have a central root, so this is basically, we have a method for taking on information from the world and making decisions in a way that we really carefully consider the information. We think about all the options. We really think about, where has this information come from? We consider it really deeply, and we are very rational about our decision making. But the problem is that is a very high demand system, and we would fast hit overload if we were to run every stimuli, every demand that's coming at us from the world through that system. And so as humans, rather than processing everything systematically, we are often influenced by factors that are peripheral to the argument, right? So they might be views of trusted others, or these really short rules of thumb that we often apply. And these are called heuristics. And I want to take you through just a few of the cognitive shortcuts, because I want you to think about these as we think about Jack and his experience, right? So the very first heuristic or rule of thumb is availability. And these are just a selection. There's actually a huge number that we use as humans. But when it comes to the availability heuristic, this is all about experience. So this is the idea that, what is it that we can call to mind easily? And we're going to make a decision based on that. So it's usually our previous experience or the experience of others that we know well. That's going to come to mind, much more readily, and we'll make a decision based on that tiny data set. Yeah, we're going to generalize and make a decision based on that. Another one is our worldview or our attitudes or our beliefs. And I kind of see this like wizardry at work. So we seek out and we listen to information that conforms to our currently held beliefs, right? We look for the things that really do reinforce what we already believe. And we readily discount or we reinterpret, so we kind of twist around other information. We do it through our own lens to make it change in line with our own views. And this is what really gets me as a cognitive scientist. If we tuck it away in our memory and recall it later, this information, if it's kind of an ambiguous message, we bring it back out of our memory and then we remember it as being really in line with our views. So not ambiguous at all. So we bring it back in line with our views. And so, that's a really powerful one, I think, is understanding, some of the worldviews. What is the lens that some of our information might be looked at through as a useful thing to be thinking about. And this to me too is really interesting, that prior knowledge or our mental models. So we take on new information and we examine it through the lens of what we already know, right? Or what we think we know but actually have wrong. So we have to join new information onto the knowledge that we already have. And if we've got some knowledge that we believe is right, but is actually incorrect, we will twist around that new information to fit what is already sitting there in terms of our mental model and our knowledge. And so there's the knowledge piece. So, you may be thinking and ticking off a few things already with Jack here. This one is fascinating. It very much is more common in Western cultures. But it's that idea that negative events are much less likely to happen to us, right? They happen to someone else. And positive events are much more likely to happen to us than someone else. And so just as an example of this, 90% of drivers think they're a better than average driver. Just think about that for a minute. How does that work, right? And 3 out of 4 baby boomers think they look younger than their peers. So just to give you an example of that, how that optimism bias works. And you can see when it comes to preparing for disaster, how that might get in the way of our preparedness or our evacuating for an event. The other one that is very strong is the social filter that we bring. We use our social networks to really assess the legitimacy of new information. Is that legitimate? Should I pay it attention? We look to see what is appropriate or desirable. That is shaped by our social networks around us. And to give you a story, and this is the photographs at the bottom there. There was a lady I'll talk about my Winston Churchill a little bit later, but there was a lady affected by the bushfires in Australia, and they call them bushfires over there instead of wildfires, but by the Black Saturday bushfires. And she was literally surrounded by fire at this point. She did have a very small window at which she could be evacuating, and she'd heard all the messages over the radio. She'd had all the information about evacuating. She was still uncertain. So I don't know if you know the geography of Australia, but it's quite a large country. And she was on, one coast, and she rang her father on the other coast. And she said, "What do I do, Dad?" And her dad said, "Leave." And so she left. So despite all of the authorities, the emergency managers, the forecaster, despite everyone having already given her that message, it took her dad to tell her, for her to leave. And that's really common. I think, hearing the message from person or agency A is often less effective than hearing it from people that you trust. And that's a really nice segue to trust. Trust is incredibly valuable. It's very important in terms of what messages that we hear and take on board. And it's determined by 2 things. It's determined by, do I think the speaker of this message or the giver of this message has real knowledge and expertise in this area, right? And a lot of authorities, you would say, absolutely, that's. And then the second question is, do they really share my values? So it's that idea, does the message come from someone who's potentially similar to me? Do I see them as similar to me? Do they have the same kind of beliefs or backgrounds? Do they understand potentially my situation or point of view, and what are their motivations? Do we believe that they've got integrity? So all of these things, maybe what has happened in the past that might have either dented or built the trust with that messenger. And so often, depending on that trust level, and that will vary in different groups of the population with different people, sometimes requests from trusted others like friends and family are more likely to be heard than requests from agencies or organizations. And I just want to point out, when it comes to fear-based messaging, so the idea that you need to do this or something bad will happen to you, there are a couple of factors. There's trust is a huge important one. Do I trust this message? Yeah, and should I listen to it? Do I trust it? And that has a lot to do with who gave it. And the second one being, do I have confidence in my ability to be able to successfully follow the advice? So, in New Zealand, we have a lot of tsunami warnings. So you might look at the ways out and think, actually, the road's going to be so gridlocked, it's just not feasible. It's just not going to happen. The advice, I get why I've been given it, but it's just not going to be possible. Or I don't have the physical mobility, like whatever reason, people may not have the confidence in their ability to be able to enact that advice successfully. If either of those are, a concern for people, then they are likely to completely ignore the message that's been given. So I think that's an important thing to be considering. Now I really want to get to the during or the immediate days with a disaster. And this here is just a very short glimpse into, I guess, our earthquake story. This all began for me and my family and our city in the middle of the night, September the 4th in 2010. And so it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was a cold spring morning for us. So we've got our seasons obviously around the wrong way. And what happened was, it just really did feel like a train was coming through the backyard, or a plane was about to come through our house. And so we were jolted out of our beds quite horrifically. And we had at the time, these are my kids 6 and 10. They're now both at university. To give you an idea as to the length of time our disaster experience has gone on for. Our city is still in rebuild mode, to give you an idea. But at the time, 6 and 10, and the whole house turned into an obstacle course. The floor, the walls, the doors, the furniture, everything was moving about. And my husband and I went one to each child. We couldn't talk to each other over the noise. So we just seemed to know that's what we were going to do. And this photograph here in the middle is not in the immediate, I'm not cruel enough to take that photo in the immediate minutes after. This is quite probably a couple of hours later, as we were still without any electricity, sitting, waiting for the ground to kind of stop groaning and moving, sitting in place at home. But, we went one to each child, and I have to do the conversion in my head, but I went to my daughter and my husband went to my son, who was 10 at the time. And to this day, he still says what was just as scary as the earthquake was his father, who's a good 100 kilos, which I think is about 220 pounds, of rugby playing bloke, New Zealand bloke, flying into his room and throwing his body over top of Caleb in his bed. So he still talks about that being probably the scariest moment, as scary as the earthquake. But for me, I guess when it comes to the psychology of after disaster, what happened in the actual minutes on moments of the disaster is probably not so much the interesting part of the story. I mean, I can tell you a lot around the myths that we all panic as a population, and there's a lot of things that actually do not play out as we often see on disaster movies. But for me, what is most interesting is what comes in the months and years afterwards. And you may be able to, as I tell just a few highlights of this, you may be able to see the parallels with your own personal or organizational experience of the disruption and everything that came with COVID. So along with raising a family at the time, I was managing a team that was under immense pressure to perform. So we were, supporting those that had lost their loved ones, but also the whole population of our city. 90-something% of our houses were damaged. Our central business district was roped off for at least 3 years and is still about halfway through being rebuilt more than 10 years on. So that was just a huge task ahead of us. And through all of that pressure as a team and as an organization, we were dealing with, over 5 years, 15,000 aftershocks. So again, 15,000 aftershocks. And that really does change the way you go about your daily life. The way that you parent, the uncertainty around your safety always. So I don't know if you're seeing any parallels with COVID, but also that constant sort of low level of anxiety that will peak and ebb along the way. And that sense of making progress. And then suddenly you're back to square one. So, with another aftershock or another outbreak of COVID. So the photograph on the left here is of my 6-year-old daughter. Every time that we would get a significant aftershock, the ground would liquefy and then bubble up above the ground as silt and water. And then that would dry, and you'd get all this dried silt called liquefaction. And then you'd have the massive task all over again every time we had one of these aftershocks of digging that liquefaction out of homes and yards and driveways and roads. And so that sense of progress and then back to square one constantly. And I think a really defining feature was that everything was longer and more complicated and more difficult than we ever imagined it was going to be in the very first days after the event. And in this, we actually did follow the same pattern, as a community that we have seen play out again and again after disaster. And so I want to take you through what that recovery journey looks like. Before I do, that's my kids now, just to give you an indication. 3 repairs of our house later, and a city still in rebuild, to give you a sense of just how long disaster recovery goes on for communities. And I think we have a greater appreciation of that. It's probably one of the silver linings of COVID. We have a greater appreciation of the long tail after disruption, and why it's not just over sorted and fixed within, a month or two. But this is the typical pattern that we see play out again and again. It's never this neat and tidy. Again, you've got the, back to square one and a whole lot of other things happening in people's lives. But it's a good rule of thumb that really communities find incredibly helpful after they've been through a disaster. And we've seen the same pattern in every disaster that we've worked in. And this is the idea that, every disaster, it's a massive disruption, and the context is going to be different, and it's going to be incredibly important because every community is different. But there does tend to be a typical journey and some common challenges, right? So we start off with what we call this heroic and honeymoon phase, and it's the idea that it's not easy, but suddenly we're all facing this common challenge. So we suddenly have something to talk about, and it's something in common that we might never have had in common with others around us. There's this huge sort of sense of uniting against this common challenge. Huge amount of energy at this point is flowing, support, energy, activity. There's a lot happening at this point. And then what we tend to find is, because the energy is going out in one direction, so when all your routines are disrupted and turned upside down, your routines normally save you brain space and time and a whole lot of energy. So when your life, the way that you work, live, operate, connect, all of those things are turned upside down. So again, some COVID parallels. It takes a lot of energy to be innovating and recreating some of those routines that often get shaped and shook up many times through the process. Holding hope takes a lot of energy, supporting others takes a lot of energy, managing your own emotions takes a lot of energy. So we've got this energy depletion exercise, and it's very natural and normal for people to suddenly find that they are feeling really fatigued, and the energy's been heading out just in one direction. And at this point, so we're entering into the dip. It's taking longer than what you think. It's harder than what you think. People have been working with processes and systems that they never imagined, and that just weren't designed, that those systems were never designed for this reality. And it's really normal also to see some division sort of start to occur. We've never seen this not happen, after a big event. And it's an idea that people are initially united by that common challenge, but they become divided over time as their different experiences, their circumstances, and their emotional tiredness play out. We see it within communities. We see it between those that are differently affected, and between teams and within teams as well. So if you're seeing that, in your organizations, that's a very normal thing to be happening after a big, massive disruption. The reality is none of us are at our best selves when we're tired, right? So you get a whole lot of people in that space, and those people and groups and teams can become a bit fractious, but emotionally tatty, a bit scratchy with each other. That's really normal. And I think too, the territory of blame and conflict at this point, early on, people have to innovate. Decisions have got to be made under pressure. And so there's a lot of action and fast thinking that happens. And invariably, some of those innovations and decisions aren't going to be perfect. They're made under pressure with imperfect information. And so at this point, there can be, when everyone's tired and fractious, some blame and conflict that comes out in teams, between teams, within groups. And I think too, the self-judgment at this point can be particularly harsh, right? We often are not reacting the way that we thought we should, or coping the way that we thought we would. And that's actually really normal. But the good news, if you keep looking, keep traveling along that graph, is that we know that the majority of people grow from massive disruption or adversity of this kind. And they grow in a variety of ways. So post-traumatic growth is a very real phenomenon. And that's not to discount the hardship or the pain that people feel, along this journey. And gosh, it can be hard to be thinking about growth when people are sitting at the bottom here. But the reason I am very passionate about talking about post-traumatic growth is because this is what, if we don't know what might be possible, what is likely to be ahead, this is what it feels like for people going through this experience. it's a really scary place to be. You know, if we don't know or we can't see the rest of the journey ahead, we feel like we're sitting on a downward slope, right? It's very demoralizing. It's like this downward trend, and we become quite anxious. What does this mean for me or for my team or for my family or my community? And it's a huge relief for communities to understand that when you're down at the bottom, which is a really normal part of the process, and it's feeling really tough, it doesn't mean that you're off track or that good things aren't ahead, right? That there aren't some amazing opportunities that are likely to come your way. So knowing that you're normal and what you're experiencing is, we find, a really huge relief to many. And that is one of the reasons that we created the Cards for Calamity. So this is for communities who are affected by disaster. For us, it was really important that they had a sense of the recovery journey. They had a sense of what's normal, that they're not alone in what you're experiencing, that they understand the challenges involved and what other community members elsewhere have done to get through these challenges. It's a huge relief and hugely empowering for communities. So this pack of cards, includes the wisdom from, 2 decades of working in disaster recovery, the cognitive science, but also all the tips and wisdom from some Winston Churchill fellowship research and working in the space of understanding what do communities really find helpful to understand and to know. So for us, it's become our mission to really support communities, teams, and organizations towards the growth piece. So if you look at this, the end of this graph here, the person standing at the very top on the right-hand side, is above where they started the other side. And again, a really tough journey usually to get there for people, a tough, long haul. And along the way, what we know is that there is a very fine balance between damage and growth. And that's for people, for communities, for teams, for organizations. And we know from experience just how, and from the research, right, just how vital it is to get intentional about minimizing the damage and maximizing growth, both for those affected by disaster, but for those working to support them also. So when it comes to community groups or support agencies and teams that are working under immense pressure for long periods, the tail after big disruption. And now you can apply this to just about any organization after COVID, right? What we're seeing is the impacts of fatigue and the rates of burnout rising. And this is something we saw in Christchurch that led to our Winston Churchill fellowships. So we really wanted to understand what are the impacts of working under prolonged stress in this kind of environment or living it in this way, and what are the things we can be doing differently or better to really tip the balance towards growth and away from damage. And one of the things that became really obvious is that stress is invisible and quite insidious for those affected by disaster or, struggling with the impacts of massive disruption. So we can break even the most resilient of people if their load is too great. And I think that's an important organizational message as well. So this can happen for people that are affected by disaster as a result of having to navigate all the systems and processes that come after disaster. And it can happen for people working in prolonged stress situations, including those who support affected communities, because the demands just feel relentless. So I want to tell you a little story. This is Anne Leadbeater, so a phenomenal local government representative in a small community called Kinglake, affected by the Black Saturday bushfires in Australia. And she was one of the very first people that I interviewed on my Winston Churchill Fellowship. And I said to her, how do you explain the long tail after a disaster and the psychology of that and why it's so difficult? And she said, well, I think what people don't understand and what I didn't understand was, I already had some stressors in my life that are just, part of life. She said it was like I had a set of bricks. There were things like, there weren't enough resources available in my job for all the demands that we had. I might have some tricky community interactions with particular groups. I had family logistics to be thinking about, financial concerns. I had aging parents. So, I kind of already had a set of bricks, and it was fine. I was managing, it was just kind of part of life. And she said this massive disruption or disaster came along and just everything became so much more complicated, having to innovate the way in which we work, connect, operate, all the logistics of navigating my way through all the recovery systems and processes, the fact that, the community, there was so much, such greater need that I was having to respond to. So everything became supersized. She said just a huge dump load of bricks got added to my pile. And she said, and we were all overloaded in the same kind of space. So it was really hard. We couldn't just share them around. And she said, but what I underestimated was how long that would go on for. And she said, so I kind of put on hold the things in my life that I would normally be expending energy on that are important to me. So, my health basics, or nurturing my relationships or the activities that give me energy. I kind of thought I'll skip those for a bit and redirect that energy to managing this pile of bricks. And because it's going to be for, just a bit, and then I'll be able to come back to all of those things that are important. And of course, it went on for longer and was harder than what was expected. And this is why we often see people ending up with eroded health or relationships really, suffering, and just a decreased quality of life as they go through their whole recovery process, because we often put on hold those things that are so vitally important because we're so overloaded. And she said to me, but then it was kind of, Paul was having trouble with his bricks, which is really understandable. And I'm just that person that said yes. So I ended up with a few more of Paul's bricks. And then she said the crux of it was when my boss came to me and said, Anne, I really hope you're looking after yourself. Like self-care, vitally important. I really hope you've got that in hand. But can you do 3 more things for me by the end of the week? Really, really important. And chuck 3 more bricks on her load. So I just really wanted to highlight this part of the recovery process. It's like people are managing 3 jobs, between, managing their family, probably the job that they already have, between all the recovery processes and, having to innovate all their routines. I mean, you've got multiple jobs going on there for people, and it goes on for a long time. So that cumulative piece is really important after disaster. And so one of the things we found with our own team is we had a team of people who were living it and working in it and dealing with this cumulative load. And we knew we had to find a way to support them. And that led again to the Winston Churchill Fellowship and a whole lot of research and a whole nother webinar around supporting people working in this environment. But for us, our challenge was, how do we get intentional about tipping the balance towards growth for our people and away from damage? And as a result of the challenge that, if this is a challenge that your team is facing, then, we have training and tools that do really help with that challenge. And, these are all the things that we wished we'd had as an organisation and as a community. And we feel, the ethical responsibility really to pay some of those learnings forwards towards others. But I just want to give you a very final note on post-traumatic growth. And this is the idea that disaster really does disrupt so much of our lives that we have to innovate out of necessity, right? And then when it comes to post-traumatic growth, that having to innovate and examine the things that are disrupted and work it all out, it means we have this opportunity to reevaluate what serves us and what doesn't, to hit reset on many things and to be much more intentional about the design of things as we go forward. And this works both, in people's lives as individuals, but also, it's an opportunity that organizations face after disaster. And it's an opportunity that we can grab hold of at a societal level as well. So, I know there's a lot of doom and gloom around, the cumulative stress and the challenge of what communities and organizations go through when they've been through massive disruption. But that post-traumatic growth piece is, exceptionally exciting. I think if we can get intentional about maximizing that along the way, along with supporting through the difficult pieces. So I just want to leave you with a parting challenge. And that is, remember I started by saying that risk, uncertainty, and disruption are now defining features of our times. Well, this is a parting challenge to think about for your organizations that you're part of. And that's the organizations that really upskill their people to be up for the challenge. There's a lot of learning out there from disasters past. Yeah. If you can upskill your people to be up for the challenge, then those are the organizations that are going to do well in the world that we now operate in. And they are the ones that are going to be set up to do well in the future, no matter what's on the horizon. And as a personal challenge, I guess my challenge to you is that we have been through a lot in the last couple of years. That is kind of, there's some parallels with what communities and the psychology of, disaster. And often, we run low on our energy because it is an energy depletion exercise, all of this having to deal with disruption. And then we can leave ourselves vulnerable to the next thing, So I think it's that, making sure we take time to reflect and process and think about the opportunities for growth, but also making sure we've got something in the tank should something else come our way. So I guess a challenge for you is how much have you got in the tank for the next thing, and to be thinking about how to refill that tank however you possibly can. So yeah, I know that's a fair bit to cover, fair bit of ground to cover, but I hope that's been helpful. And I really welcome your questions.
Well, I'm assuming everybody is applauding, but of course we have blocked their audio. So Jolie, you can't hear them applauding, but I'm quite certain that that's what's going on. Bravo. And thank you so much for really an incredibly interesting look at this kind of thing, and to bring into bear here some perspectives that I think a lot of us would never have come across or having yet come across, and at least for me are particularly intriguing. But it's not about me. Let me go to the questions and see what are some of the things that folks have been asking. Right up front, which has disappeared from my list, I can tell you, though, that somebody was asking about good way to contact you, and it was a person who thinks you might be a wonderful guest speaker at a conference that he runs or she runs. My apologies for losing the person. Do you have a preferred method of contact?
I do. I'll pop this back up because on the last slide, I have my contact details for you. Yeah, happy to. Anyone feel free to reach out. As I said, we're passionate about making sure we pass on some of these learnings to others that, could really put them in place.
Terrific. Thank you for sharing that. We appreciate it. All right. So Ted has asked the following question. He says, Jolie, have you seen the 2015 Norwegian film called The Wave? It is far different from the usual disaster film and covers much of what you have discussed.
And the answer is no, and I'm really excited to see one that I haven't seen, actually. So I feel like I've seen everything, like right through to Sharknado or whatever that horrible film was. So I've seen some amazing examples that really do represent disaster recovery well, and some pretty shocking ones.
Are there any that come to mind for you that represent it well?
I'm trying to think of, and someone may be able to remember the name of it. There was a mini-series based on New Orleans.
Oh, right. It's named after the section of New Orleans.
Yes.
Yeah.
That one, I thought did a brilliant job. I'll just have a quick look and see if I can find it.
That's fantastic of you to take a look. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it as well, but I know exactly. The Treme.
Yes. Let me pop that in the Q&A. Treme, that was a great example, I think, of it done well.
Terrific. It gives us all something to take another look at from this perspective, right? To think about it this way.
Absolutely. All right. And I will check out that film. Thank you for the recommendation.
I have not seen it, or I would comment. I don't know it either. All right. Philip is asking, how has public policy changed in the direction of mandating earthquake mitigation?
That one I can't answer for the USA because I'm only newly arrived, right. But I can answer in New Zealand. That's been a real challenge, I think. So a lot of the deaths from the Christchurch earthquakes, and I should say, we had no deaths from the very first earthquake, which was a 7.1, very shallow, very close to the city. And we had no deaths. And I have to say, we were probably feeling a little bit smug at that point because it wasn't long after Haiti, and we were feeling quite proud of ourselves and all our earthquake standards, right, and our building code. And then, of course, we had 15,000 aftershocks, and it was one of the aftershocks 6 months later that claimed the lives of 185 people.
Oh my gosh!
That happened through there were three main ways that people lost their lives. One was through landslide, which and rockfall, but the main two ways was from unreinforced masonry. So we had some beautiful old heritage buildings where the tops of the outside came down into the street. And that particular earthquake happened at lunchtime. So a lot of people out and about in our city where the fronts of those buildings came down, including crushing a bus where there was only one survivor on that bus with the masonry coming down, to give you an idea of the impact that had. And then the vast majority of people died in two buildings that weren't particularly old, should not have failed, and had been signed off with design flaws. So had gone through the process, the correct process, but there had been human error in the design of the building, the sign off of the building, and everything that happened. So for two, there was a vast majority of the people who lost their lives in those two buildings. There's been a lot of work to change and mandate earthquake mitigation in New Zealand as a result, but with mixed results. There was, huge inquiry review, but the challenge, I think, of working with owners to mandate that, it's been really difficult. So we have everything from, and there's the survivor on the bus in particular, she's a lecturer at the University of Canterbury, very smart lady who understands, how to work with government and change policy, change law, and she's had incredible influence, but again, probably not as much as she would like to see some of those laws changed, or some of the mandates made stronger in terms of when and how those earthquake mitigations need to be made. And we do have, the requirement that in every building in Wellington, which is one of our most earthquake prone buildings, has a sticker on the outside giving you the rating of how earthquake prone it is, so that it becomes much more a public choice as to whether or not you go into those buildings. So it's a work in progress. There's definitely been some changes, but I would say not enough. I don't know if that's helpful in terms of the US context, but that's where we're at in New Zealand. Yeah.
Well, I cannot speak myself to the earthquake issues in the US, but I'm in the southeast of the United States where tornadoes are an issue. And I can say in terms of building structures, right, we face a similar set of challenges. And to me, one of the key issues is really, I think, what you were kind of hinting at, or we're speaking to in terms of enforcement. Right. So even when we get policies or laws changed, it's the enforcement level, people actually living up to the expectation that I think is terribly challenging at the behavioral level for stuff. Okay. We have more questions for you. Okay. Dan says, you mentioned tools developed for dealing with post-disaster trauma. Could you describe these a little more?
Sure. So there's a couple that I can tell you a little bit about. One is the cards for calamity, and the backstory to that is Elizabeth and I would see this, the same challenges being encountered by communities again and again, and just how painful it is to be coming smack up against these challenges that you don't expect without the knowledge that you need. And so for us, we were working in two different disasters in two different places at the time, and sending between the research and our experience, sending backwards and forwards the messages that we knew people who were living disaster recovery themselves needed to know. Often, we upskill and equip organizations, but we forget to make sure that people on the ground, they are the ones that are doing the hard work and supporting each other and leading their communities. So how do we make sure they've got the knowledge that they need? And so with these messages going backwards and forwards between these disaster zones, Elizabeth and I wrote a book. And then I'm a cognitive scientist. I really am fascinated by how little brain space we have when we're affected by prolonged stress. And as I said, I've been my own social experiment. And one day I said to Elizabeth, this is just silly. Who's got time and brain space to read a book after a disaster? And so we deconstructed that book into the cards for calamity. So in there's really practical tips around some of the logistics that you face and some of the challenges that you come up across. There's tips around parenting and the anxiety of that, so as a parent myself, I really mourned the loss of the innocence that my children had. And then I came to the realization that actually, if someone had told me that they will come out okay, and if in all likelihood, you will see some impacts, but you will also see some ways in which they are stronger. So I look back now and I can see, I can definitely see the impacts on them, but I can also see how they have greater empathy and resilience. COVID has been just a breeze for them. They've lived in a disaster zone their whole life. So, so it's quite fascinating, just some of the things, everything from some of the cognitive science to handling just life admin that's supersized, all packaged up into, a set of cards. They look like this. Yeah, and in Australia, Australian Red Cross has partnered with us, and they have made them available to every community affected by the Black Summer bushfires, so the huge wildfires they had a couple of summers ago.
Right.
And they've just had a massive nationwide distribution to make sure that we're empowering people on the ground with the knowledge that they need. And then the other one that I can tell you a little bit about is the Doing Well pack. I'll get it the right way around. And this was, as I said, we were seeing the burnout rise, significantly, and the very serious impacts that became very clear through our Winston Churchill Fellowship of people working in this prolonged stress environment. And it's like any other hazard. If we had someone working up on scaffolding, it's really clear in our mind what's going to happen if something goes wrong. But right. I don't think, I think the negative impacts can be just as serious, but they sneak up on us and they're not as obvious. And so we're not as good as managing prolonged stress in teams. And so the Doing Well pack is all about that, sustaining teams to really support their performance and their well-being. It's the thing that we struggled with most and we most needed. So that was a big part of our design challenge. And then the last thing I'd say is we've got a couple of workshops in a box. So that's the idea around, especially at the moment, building team cohesion and well-being and having what you need to perform as teams when people are feeling so disconnected and tired, turning that around again, trying to prevent that burnout that is, unnecessary if we really, put the right things in place for teams. And one for leaders so that they have the tools and skills, because gosh, it's a tough gig being a leader in this kind of environment. So for leaders, how do we set them up to really support the well-being and performance of their teams? So yeah, so a couple of bits and pieces that we really wanted and needed, and we know now that are really helpful for others. So
terrific. I love the label of a workshop in a box. I just think that is a great way to conceptualize that and to make it really usable.
Yes.
For people under, undesirable circumstances, certainly. Absolutely. So, and I also think that, the stress stuff that builds up, we don't always, I think, even associate something we're feeling or experiencing. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily make the right attribution back to stress, right? And that makes it even harder then to sort of figure out, what do I do in the face of what I'm experiencing? And relatedly, Rob has asked the question. He says, "Thank you, Jolie. I'm curious if you could share more info in terms of filling the tank. It feels we're stuck in the empty signifier of self-care without the spaciousness to explore what that means." Yeah. Isn't that poetical?
It is. It's a beautiful comment, actually, in question. So if this is helpful, I guess, when we were facing the challenge with our own team, we knew they were all affected. Like, they were being led by a leader, me, affected by the earthquakes, having to go through it with my family. They were a team of people who were affected by the earthquakes, who were supporting community members affected by the earthquakes. It was a whole system under pressure. And I just knew from my background that we had to find a way to sustain everybody, that we had to find a way to protect and support people to be able to keep doing, good things in the way that we needed to. And we threw everything we could possibly think of at this team. We had briefing, debriefing, we had training, we had peer support, mentoring, professional supervision, yoga at lunchtime, walking groups, you name it. Like, we threw the kit and caboodle at this team. And the reality is we were still burning them out, right? Which is really what led to us, putting together the likes of this, which is much more designed to respond to having to perform under pressure. Like, there's a lot of talk around, okay, taking a break or really finding the space and time to reflect. And often people don't have the ability to take the break or do what they need. So for us, what we were seeing is this big gap between knowing what people need to do. Like we all knew that we needed to eat 5 fruit and veggies a day, that we all needed to get good exercise, right? We should be connected to others. But being able to do that under pressure started to feel impossible. And for us, it was trying to bridge that gap and making it really practical and effective when the pressure's on. And so there is a lot of empty, throwing around of self-care, I think, in terms of that can be a privilege that often people don't have. And I think too, it can be used by organizations when we don't acknowledge the organizational responsibility as well. If you think about Anne and her bricks, right? And just take care of yourself, and I'm just going to keep loading you up. That's not going to work. So we talk about the triple responsibility, and it's the idea that we do have a lot of power as individuals if we understand how it is to bridge that gap between knowing it and doing it. And then at a team level, there's a lot of influence. So self-care is important, I guess I'm saying, like filling your tank up, because I think, as Anne said, she put a lot of things on hold, and we see just the impacts on people's relationships, on their health. And so I think it's really understanding what is critically important in your life and finding a way to protect that. So, something I'm going to tell just a couple of stories to reinforce that before I get to the other two pieces. But something I would encourage people to do is think about what is really important in my life that I just don't want to sacrifice. And then I want you to check your to-do list or your calendar and see whether it's reflected in there. Because especially in these kind of mass disruption times or after disaster, it'll keep dropping off the bottom. And if you do that for a significant amount of time, you end up with some pretty significant impacts, So I think for me, the self-care piece is much more around what is really important to you. Is it your health, your relationships, your career, like whatever it is that is really important to you? How do we find a way to make sure that we protect it through this? So self-care, I think, is often, I think, a very light term, but there's more to it. The other story that I often tell is, I was told this for a reason, I clearly understand at the time, but Dr. Kate Brady, an amazing recovery leader in Australia, she told me a story that has really helped me find a way to prioritize me, knowing that, prioritizing me is going to have an impact on the work that I do. And she said, Jolie, I went to this job interview very early in my career, and she said, it was, one of my very first interviewing for a professional job. She said, I was hitting it out of the park. Like I was nailing all the questions. I had all the right answers. I was feeling really good. And she said, and then the hiring manager threw me a curveball and I didn't know what to do with it. She said, the question was, Kate, are you a martyr or are you a professional? And Kate sort of said, sorry, I don't understand. And she said, well, no problem either way. Like I have a clear preference, but I've learned how to manage both, right? If you're a martyr, you're going to be the first one here, the last one to leave. You'll fill every gap in my roster. You'll say yes when you really shouldn't. You'll care deeply, but you'll burn hard, fast, and you'll burn out. She said, I know that, we'll get a lot of effort and a lot of work out of you while you're here, but there's no real point in me investing professional supervision in you, and career, professional development, in you.
Right.
And she said, but if you are a professional, you will still care deeply about what it is we're here to do, but you will have some boundaries in place so that you can sustain yourself. You'll probably say no occasionally when I want you to say yes. You'll understand that by doing that, you'll be able to sustain yourself and you'll have a much greater impact in the long term. And I can invest in you like that. That's what I'd rather you are. Which is it, Kate? Just so I know how to manage you. Are you a martyr or are you a professional? And in full disclosure, I'm a recovering martyr. Right. So it's a question I use to guide myself often. So, just in terms of we do have a real responsibility at that individual piece. And then at the team level, we've all probably been part of teams that are kind of toxic and, where people undermine each other's well-being. But the flip side of that is you can have amazing power at the team level to support each other. If we understand each other's stress responses, we really talk about stress as a human biological thing, not something that, is a sign of weakness or, to really understanding how we can support each other as a team. And lastly, at an organizational level, there's a lot of responsibility there to understand what are the organizational bricks and trying to get to stress at the source. and any other hazard would have training in place. It would have personal protective equipment, which is, where you can have a well-being plan in place. Like that's what the Doing Well cards are all about. So there's a lot that we need to do at the organizational level as well. So I know that's a little bit bigger than what Rob was saying, but hopefully that's covered a little bit of what he was after.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's just terrific. Ted is also asking to address the psychology on how people think about messages and response. What are your thoughts on disaster education in schools? Catch them early in lives and potentially carry those lessons home.
There's a great example of this by American Red Cross, and I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's about the Pillowcase Project. So it's the idea that there's an education program with kids where they understand preparedness and what should be in a go bag, and they literally create and design their own pillowcase that can become a go bag. And one of the greatest impacts of that is the education that happens when they go home to their families, right? And again, if you think about all the things that get in the way sometimes between the message and the action, if we tap into what people really care about, our kids and their education, it's a really important thing I would say is with kids that we often forget. There's a couple of things, how kids do depends a lot after disaster on how their parents are doing. So for me, supporting parents is a really important piece rather than supporting kids directly. But there's a lot that we can be involving kids, and we forget that actually if kids have actions and things that they can do in terms of preparedness, but also post-disaster recovery, they feel less anxiety, they can contribute, if it's age and developmentally, appropriate, there's a lot that we can be, really supporting kids with if it's empowering. And again, not that fear-based messaging where, we don't have anything that we can put in place to empower ourselves to act. Yeah.
Terrific. I'm a big believer in working through young school-age children to influence families for the better. I think that is a really powerful route, just as you have described.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure.
Eric has we are at 1 o'clock, and I know that some people may be leaving, but I think, unless Gideon corrects me, we can answer a few more questions, Jolie, if you're willing to continue.
That would be just fine. Yeah, this is very, very engaging. So thank you.
Fantastic. Great. All right. So Eric's question is, you mentioned Western cultures. Are there things we can learn from Eastern cultures with respect to disaster recovery?
Well, it's interesting because I don't feel that I can be a spokesperson for Eastern culture and do it justice, but I can tell you a couple of stories in case that's helpful. The answer is yes. I think there's a lot that can get in the way sometimes of our Western thinking. So one example of this is, and I don't recommend anyone does this, by the way, but after the Christchurch earthquakes, part of my role was supporting those that lost their loved ones. And this would be maybe 2 years in, we had the Dalai Lama come and speak, and he spoke to a wide public audience in Christchurch, but he also had a private audience with the families. And one of the comments that someone said was, how am I meant to live after this? Like, how am I meant to look forward and go on? Like, it just seems impossible. And he's the only person that I think I know in the world who could get away with this message. So don't anyone else take it on board and do it. But I think he basically said to them, it's a very Western notion that if we plan for happiness and we do all the right things and we work hard and we do all the things that we should, that we deserve and expect a happy life. And he's like, life is full of curveballs and grief and trauma and the things that happen along the way. That is part of life. And it's not shouldn't be a poor me. And you never say this to someone who's lost a loved one, but the way in which he couched it was amazing. But we do have this Western notion, even for me, of the innocence that my children had lost. I remember speaking to someone who'd been through, war in Eastern Europe, who said that's a very Western thing, and actually it made me realize we sometimes try to protect our children rather than prepare our children for the world. So, there's definitely some Western things that I think we could definitely learn from others who have had to learn resilience in other ways. And on the Winston Churchill Fellowship, I visited all sorts of countries and places, most of them being, but intentionally, more similar to New Zealand and our middle class kind of culture, our organized government systems, all of those things, quite intentionally, so I can bring back the learnings that were useful. But I was quite fearful of the cultural differences and how I might actually get it wrong, in my research, and being, stepping very carefully. And what fascinated me in talking about, the cumulative stress after disaster, but also what is it that people need, who are working in this environment. In New Zealand, we have what we call the number 8 wire complex. And that's the idea for the European settlers that came to New Zealand. They had to clear the land with very dense wood, timber, forest. They had to pretty much survive on their own. And we have this idea in New Zealand that you've got to be self-sufficient. And the number 8 wire comes from, you should be able to fix anything with a piece of fencing wire. Otherwise, it's New Zealand, right? And so we have the sense of we've got to be self-sufficient, so we don't really ask for support when we need it. And I'm like, okay, well, that's definitely a New Zealand cultural thing. Australia had something similar. When I spoke to people here in the States after the various different disasters that we explored, people saying we're kind of different. We have our, John Wayne complex. We don't really, admit weakness, like it was. So we're different to you Kiwis. And I'm thinking, we've got a different story, but actually I think we're quite similar. And then I went to Japan, and there, but samurai do not admit weakness. So, we're different because we don't, admit that we need support or help. And I'm thinking, we've got some cultural differences for sure, but we also have some similarities. And then the last thing I would say is in New Zealand, we have the Māori culture, our Indigenous culture, and so far advanced of our Western thinking in terms of well-being and health, and basically the idea that health is a very holistic thing. And so they talk about it being like a whare, which is a house. So it's multidimensional. You've got spiritual health, you've got physical health, mental health, like emotional health, social health. If any one of those walls are weak, then your house is unstable. So we tend to focus often on the physical health and, denigrate some of the other areas or have stigma or, are not as open in the Western cultures as to understanding the more holistic approach to being well and being able to perform well as human beings. So there's a lot that we've definitely learned, I think, in New Zealand from our Indigenous culture around, a holistic approach to making sure we look after ourselves.
And it sounds like that maybe also involves a shift sort of away from a kind of blame sensibility, looking for, blaming the individual, like blaming the victim and that kind of thinking, because how is that helpful in making sure your walls are all strong? Yeah.
And I think one of the myths is that people who go through a disaster are going to be traumatized and will need, psychological intervention. And I think there's going to be a proportion for sure, we always know do, but the vast majority of people are going to go through that curve where they have a really tough time and they need support through that tough time, but a lot of it is support from each other, support with knowledge and information, support around addressing the stressors that they are being,
right.
All of the systems that aren't designed for them. Like if we could actually address some of the source of their stress, but most people are going to have a tough time and most people will come out the other end just fine. They'll have a hard time getting there, but most people will actually grow as a result, which I think we're very good at pathologizing, a very natural, normal response to what people go through after disaster.
I think we do a lot of pathologizing, generally speaking, at least over on this side of the world. Yeah. Angie has, I think, a more kind of personally directed question for you. She says, Jolie, do you feel that you have post-trauma recovered after disaster? As a survivor herself of, that is Angie, as a survivor of the August 2020 derecho, she says, I think 10 years later is a good time frame.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think, again, someone mentioned before, just having the time and space to work out where you're at and to process. And I think often you've got to get through the thick of it. There's a lot of tasks to be done when you're in the bottom of that curve, and then there's a lot of processing that happens before you can really work your way up the other side. Right. So I would say, yes, definitely recovered. I still see some lingering things that I know have, like I still probably brace myself if a bus goes past and the ground rumbles, and that's a very normal response. but yeah, I can see probably all the gifts as a result. And so, you know, I think for me, seeing the things that the knowledge and the learning and in my family and in my community and those around me, I think that's for me when I feel like recovery has happened. There'll always be some lingering effects. It's like that damage and growth. There's always going to be some things on both sides. But for me, the balance is well and truly tipped towards the growth. And yeah, if that helps.
Well, that is just terrific. And there are people thanking you. And then we can end on Beth's comment, which she says is more of a comment than a question. And she says, this was excellent, Jolie. Thank you. Comment versus question. If you are familiar with crew resource management, or in my setting, we call our version clinical team training, the notion of heuristic traps is discussed in reference to safety. Your slide discussing a selection of shortcuts was an aha moment for me in relation to disasters and our perception. I found that portion of your presentation super insightful. And more people are offering their thanks for your presentation and how wonderful it was. So I think that is a good note upon which we can wrap this up. Gideon, I'm going to toss the ball back over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. That was fantastic, super insightful. I love the details and just everything that was addressed. Yes, that is it. I believe that brings everything to an end today. That's all the time we have. For those of you that are still with us, we will make this video available to weatherband members at amsweatherband.org and at ametsoc.org. So yes, if you have further questions, please feel free to join the Weatherband Community Forum and put them out there, and we'll see if we can't get them answered. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Again, I want to thank Jolie and Dr. Jasko. Thank you so much for your contributions. We appreciate it very much. And yes, with that, take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.